no. See, look at now. I'm seeing my screen.
Okay, well, this has taught all of us how to be like our own little producers.
Well, I totally underestimate like how many things are involved with trying to put together a stupid little podcast.
Just any media, right? Like it's just
and
incredible.
This has forced everybody to try to learn how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like and like just watching all these different churches try to figure out, like, suddenly, everybody was kind of like tiptoeing around, we're gonna have to figure out that media stuff eventually, but like, let's keep just focusing on church. And then suddenly, oh well, now that's all we have, so we better figure it out.
Yes, I say that. Well, I had a chat with my spiritual director earlier today, and he's a really cool gentleman. He was a Presbyterian minister for a very long time, and is in his either in his 70s or right about there. So just a very cool kind of mentor type relationship. Anyway, but we were talking about how this has really been something of a pressure cooker. Like it hasn't changed the trajectory of society in any really conceivable way, at least as far as I can tell, but has more just exaggerated the trends that were already there, like sort of accelerated the rate of change, if not the direction of it.
That's an interesting perspective.
Well, I mean, at the very least, from where I stand within the church, that's what I've been noticing, right? Like just a very, very basic way to sort of test that hypothesis is you look at attendance. I mean, it's not actual attendance, but it's not the greatest metric. And I have a whole rant I could go on about the way that people use statistics in the wrong kind of way. But for this purpose, like, the folks that we know for certain are actually tracking with us in any kind of meaningful way are pretty much the 40 plus crowd, right? Anybody that's kind of my generation or below is hit and miss at best. And most of the people under 20 have not attended a church service since COVID pretty well, right? Like they're actual, like, showing up, as it were, to the broadcast or watching the YouTube video or whatever else is essentially non-existent, right? Which is just interesting. That correlates with the trends that we've seen demographically anyway, right? It's just, it's exaggerated. I'll be curious to see once we are done with lockdown stuff or whatever, just how true that actually ends up being, or if people are going to, in sort of a wave of conservatism, cling to what used to be in a way that kind of perpetuates it further. Well,
it's weird because it wouldn't even like, because of going through a situation that has just forced everybody to transform, like, business models and church models and everything models into something different, it wouldn't even be conservatism to go back, because it would be like, that's a different system that we aren't doing anymore. It's like, do we want to go and try out this other system that we've done before, and was it better?
Right.
Like that's still actually a stepping forward into something different again.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to use a geography analogy, it's sort of like we hit the fork in the road, and the question is, are we going to continue, or are we going to kind of force our way back, whether that's backtracking or just cutting right across, unscouted terrain to try and get back to where we think it was supposed to go, right? It's an interesting point. I wonder where we'll end up. But anyhow.
You said, though, like the trends for, like, attendance in the church were kind of like, you saw things kind of go in this direction anyways, of like people, young adults anyways, kind of just steadily dropping off.
Yes. Yeah.
I've been trying to understand why, because, like, I literally feel like, from my own perspective, being like mid-20s something, like I feel like I understand the need for church on some level, but I don't feel drawn to it.
Oh, no, for sure. And I don't know, I find myself even, so I actually, I work in a church. My livelihood at this juncture of life is, helping, young people kind of try and understand this Jesus guy a little bit better. And that, of course, requires, or at least tends to require, employment at a church. And, I'm grateful for that. So as somebody in the system, I would echo your sentiment, right? There is something about how church happens that I don't know I'm especially drawn to. And I might even liken it to politics, which is not a great correlation, but there's something that I see as both necessary and yet completely unappealing about politics at the same time that I feel drawn to learn about it and know about it and be involved, right? So there's sort of I don't know, almost like
it's not a necessary
willing
evil, but it's
no, yeah, it's almost like some kind of a mistaste or whatever. It's like it's a flavor I don't like, but that I know I need to eat or something. Like, there's something at once like gratifying and yet unappealing about it, or at least that's how I feel about church in general.
right.
Maybe
Well,
it's just
is it
structures as
even
a whole. I
like
don't know.
so? Bringing it into that food analogy, that actually makes me think about it a little differently, because that is, I think that's the same problem we're struggling with, even when it comes to food, is that we know what's good for us. It's not, and like nobody's really wondering what they should be eating. I mean, you get to like a specific point of like trying out different diets and stuff, but like we know we should eat our vegetables, and we know we shouldn't eat a lot of, bad fats and processed sugars and stuff like that. But we do it anyways because it's so available, and it's marketed to us in a lot of subliminal and subversive ways, where we're just like, that's just what we're going to do on every level of all of the things that we're sort of, depending on what your perspective is, but like we're designed to see value in. All of those sensors for like, community, good food, good, interesting ideas. Like, we've figured out how to market the most interesting ideas with the least nutritional value, and the most, exciting flavors with the least nutritional value. It's like on every level, it's becoming more and more difficult to make the right decision about what you should put in your life, because there's so much easy access to hyper palatable ways to satisfy those desires.
Well, and actually, so it's interesting you say that to me sort of ties in with I guess we're kind of talking about church at the moment, but really more broadly, this idea of societal change and shifts and how we're sort of maybe noticing some of those things. And that idea that you mentioned marketing and the way that we're sort of turning things, whether it's palatable, right? Whether something can be sold, or what's its appeal value in whatever way. There's a hyper individualized, consumerized worldview that I think really undergirds most of certainly how our generation thinks about things, and I think by extension how we actually operate within society. That is part of this pressure cooker thing I was mentioning, where I think that COVID has exaggerated those trends. So one of the big things that I would point to, specifically with church attendance, but probably this is just true of most parts of life that have been forced online these days that previously were not exclusively online. It's the difference between something being an event versus an episode, right? And that distinction is huge, but we don't, I think, fully.
Can you define the difference, like an event versus an episode?
So just to say where I'm familiar, but with church attendance or church services, right? If you have something in person that is a service, right? You go to that, you participate in that. It's at a specific time with a particular people. There's a limit to when you have access to it. So there's an exclusivity piece to it. Right. So it requires you actually putting it into your calendar, organizing your day around it, and certainly within the context of religious services, there's almost a ritual element to that. So it becomes part of your routine. You do it every day. You drive the same route. You maybe even go to the same place after lunch. So that becomes an event, right? Your day is structured around this experience that you have, right? Versus the moment you move something exclusively online, our minds make a switch, and you're now dealing with an episode of a new show, right? It's archived. It's permanent. It's there whenever I want it. It's on demand, right? So I suppose for us, we've been trying to navigate this change, or
community is not content,
right? But that's what we've been forced into, right? Like it's almost everything is content generation now, like regardless of how passive it is. Even work-related items to a degree seem to be almost content generation. At least, I laugh when my wife has to try and facilitate these team meetings that she manages, right, in an online forum, right? Or she was on mat leave, and so before
congratulations,
the pandemic,
by the way. Baby number 2 along the way. We haven't like talked in like
I know it's
2 years or so, maybe I don't know how long.
No, it's just been nuts. Life is insane all around. But
sorry, Amy was on mat leave.
No. Well, right. But so my wife was on mat leave prior to this pandemic, and then came back to her role completely remotely now. in the pandemic, right? Partway through, maybe more than halfway through it, I guess. And
it's a weird way to come back to it.
Well, right. So already that's a jarring change, but now she's got new employees that have been hired that she wasn't necessarily a part of the hiring process for.
Right.
And now she's having to get to know these people in an online forum entirely, right? Leading a team, managing. So all that to say that there's almost a performance quality that comes with being squatted in front of a screen and having to use setups like this.
Right.
And so even something as simple as management, not that that's by any means a simple thing,
Right.
But something like that almost has these kind of undertones of kind of content generation, or if not generation, content management, right? How do I sort of, what's my persona? How am I coming across on the screen? And,
right.
That whole attitude.
And that's so weird. I think it's like really, really unhealthy too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like
the social dynamic that content generation forces you into, like the way you think about, like even just what you're saying, like thinking about presenting yourself, you're not thinking about presenting yourself to a person, you're thinking about presenting yourself to an audience.
Mm-hmm. Which is completely ambiguous, right? It's nobody. An audience is literally like, yeah, it's comprised of individuals, but the makeup of which, the specifics of which you don't know, right? You might be able to guess, you might have some idea, but even a small community, like for our congregation, we're somewhere hovering around the 200-ish mark at our church. Which number do you take? Do you take before the pandemic? Do you take now? Those are two very different potential answers, right?
We had 200 people attending, but now we have 500 subscribers. So I don't.
But no, like right there though, like I think you're speaking to the heart of the matter. Like there's an unhealthy. Well, it's not to crap on YouTubers or YouTube or content generation as
it's just medium. A different thing.
Yeah, like I mean, it's entertainment fundamentally, right? Content generation is entertainment. YouTube is an entertainment platform primarily, or arguably an advertising platform that's wrapped up in entertainment. But then again, what entertainment isn't just advertising, right? Notwithstanding, it's not bad, right? It's its own thing, right? What's different in this is what you said. It's that social dynamic that's shifted. Yeah. So the actual the mores, right? This little kernels of sort of societal agreements and social interactions and exchanges that we have shifted, right? And to be fair, human beings are pretty adaptable to these sorts of things. We learn how to communicate in these mediums, and for the most part, we're resilient species, I think, and have done a fairly good job adjusting to the times, at least more or less. Like there's definitely challenges. Let's not undermine that by any means. But for certain roles, for my line of work, we're the not-for-profit sector, and at that, religious education or religious services and so on. That's kind of what we're all up to, right? That does not lend itself well to content, right? The way that we typically think of it. Like we've found ourselves having to look for wisdom from YouTubers or just from other churches or faith organizations or whatever that have, I don't know, found a way to do this, right?
Have you figured out any ways to kind of break past the audience producer dynamic, like just even reaching out to people individually, or?
Well, okay, so yes, but I suppose my personal opinion, this is by no means the stance of the church that I serve, but my personal opinion is that we haven't. I've yet to discover say a church or even like, I don't know, any entity really, like politicians are not adapting to this well either. Like CNN interviews tend to be kind of cringy these days with people's backgrounds looking the way they do. I mean, we're managing, we're getting by, and everyone has a lot of grace for one another, and that's all good stuff. But no, as an organization, as an institution, I mean, institutions by their very nature are supposed to change slowly, right?
Right.
Very quick seismic shift tends to collapse.
Yeah.
Businesses, whatever, right? So there's something at odds between our own personal or societal flexibility or malleability, right? The social exchanges that we're able to have with one another. There's resiliency and ingenuity there that at an institutional level, I think is just not up to par. And how could it be, right? Like in a way, like how do you take something like a classroom and suddenly make that entirely online and have it be even remotely close to what people are used to experiencing from the institution of school, right? You can't take the institution of school and make it online purely overnight or over a couple of weeks and have students have the same experience. What you have to do is take the concept of education and rework that for an online medium, right? That is a difficult task to do when you've got employees, tax obligations, laws written that entrench certain practices and requirements, bus schedules that support the entirety of a small business, mentality within our culture. Like it's
You're using
pervasive.
a system to meet a problem that it utterly was not evolved to meet.
Precisely. And so how
it's specialized to do something, and it's not this.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that regard, grateful that schools are back in person in Ontario these days. That's good to see. But the point still stands. The institution of school was very slow to adopt online learning to begin with. I mean, one of the greater ironies of this whole thing that I think is hilarious, if you recall, in Ontario, before COVID happened, we were in the middle of a strike across the entire province, and there were two primary issues that were going on in that strike, right? Okay. If I can remember,
I don't actually know what the issues were,
and so this is based on my limited recollection without looking up notes and whatever else, right? But there's two issues of primary importance as I understood them. One of which had to do with class sizes, and the other had to do with online learning. And the teachers were taking issue with the province's stance on making classes larger. They said, no, we actually need smaller classes, which is a point that I would agree with, point teachers. But then the government was actually saying that they wanted to make an online class mandatory. Like every student would have to take at least a certain percentage of courses online in order to facilitate digital learning skills because of the direction that school was moving, right? So for university and so on, so many people were finding themselves ill-equipped for online learning, right? And I find the outcome of that to be entirely hilarious, right? Like you've got the teachers won out on the class sizes issue, and they absolutely lost on online learning, right? So, you both had good points, and we've found some kind of agreement whether we wanted to or not, right?
The Lord judged.
Well, right, perhaps, but there you have it. I mean, that's I think an interesting example where the systems as they were at almost an effective gridlock, right? Like to have a rolling strike across the full province has been a long time since anything like that happened. I don't believe in my entire schooling system. So since 91, I don't believe there was an instance of a rolling strike, at least not that I can remember. They were always regional. So there you have an example where the system as it was at an effective gridlock, and yet it's been forced to shift. It's been forced to evolve in a way that it already was trending, but that institutional resilience, or if you want to call it that, was preventing any kind of meaningful traction, right? So it's interesting. Like, I mean, there are some people that might look at this whole COVID lockdown thing as all bad. I don't know that it is. I think that it's really neither here nor there. COVID is itself kind of a non-issue or non sequitur when it comes to the actual cultural problems we're discussing. It's merely the catalyst on which all of those reactions have been sort of taking place. It's not the thing itself. It would have happened on its own over time. This just made it happen faster.
I think like any stressor, though, it's like it can cause you to get to where you need to be faster or to move forward faster, but also to all of the many people who, or businesses and institutions who aren't equipped to get there, or just don't have the resources mentally, emotionally, community-wise, physically, financially. If they didn't have the resources to make it to this next step, it was just like, this is just a mass apocalypse of many people's journeys towards something. And it's just, sorry, you got to start back at square one.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, I suppose I would suggest that it probably was inevitable, and that might be a bit of a hard stance to take, actually. But presumably, if folks struggled to make the adjustment to a primarily online format, if that's the issue, right? So I'm not here referring to, brick and mortar businesses to the same degree, right? Places like restaurants and so on that they require clientele. So I'm not referring to those businesses, but other forms of business that are capable of moving online. If they have struggled to do that,
right,
probably they were going to fail.
This was the push.
Yeah, like it's kind of, writing was probably already on the wall, and maybe you could have milked out another couple years without COVID having happened.
Yeah.
But likely the changes were already there. It's just they happened sooner than you might have expected. That's, I guess, my point.
I guess I'm looking at
restaurants and stuff like
at
that.
a lot of like individuals, like looking at people who are trying to start university right as COVID lockdowns began, and it's like all the really, really vital communities for establishing yourself and establishing a network and being able to have a profitable time on a university campus. None of that happened. And looking also at a lot of, I mean, I work with like teaching young kids, mostly young kids, some older kids, music, and just looking at a lot of them, the way their social development has taken a huge dip in that, like, for one thing, like they have to figure out how to do everything online, which is just not the same. Like you said, it's not the same engagement, not the same social mores. And so they're missing a huge, I mean, like you said too, like people are resilient, and especially kids probably.
More than we give them credit for.
Yeah. I guess I'm kind of scared about it, but I don't know. Maybe they're going to make it through all right. It seems concerning to me anyways.
No, I definitely echo your sentiment, and I just want to like clarify. My heart absolutely breaks specifically for university students. Like anybody sort of 17, 18, 19 that's trying to make those first forays into sort of young adulthood. That's the age group that I'm most concerned about, just because they've already been dealing with, unaddressed mental health concerns at a epidemic level, right? And I don't use that term lightly. Like it really is. There's a mental health crisis in Canada, certainly, and I would say probably the West in general, if not even just globally. But that was kind of lurking under the surface
already,
to an enormous degree, right?
Accelerated that, yeah.
And that's what I mean. So when we talk about, like, I use this metaphor of a pressure cooker. I feel for some reason it's a helpful one. Maybe not, but already you've got
I think I didn't get what you were saying with it at first, but I see it's like kind of just distilling everything down to these are what the actual issues were.
Well, yeah, like you're taking all of this atmosphere and just making it dense and like it's primed to blow in a way, right? Like a pressure cooker is not unlike a pipe bomb if it fails. But never minding that.
I mean, that might be an important part of the metaphor.
It could be, but I think of people in my own close circles that I know have been struggling, maybe even just dabbling, if we want to call it that, not necessarily struggling, if they were dabbling with mental health, which is a terrible way to describe it, but faltering from time to time.
Or dabbling with self-diagnosis anyways.
Well, I mean, that's its own, oh gosh, do we want to go down that rabbit trail? Who knows? I will say this. I lament the fact that we have a clinical vocabulary with respect to mental health, and just our understanding has been so clinicized. If that's a word, I don't know if I can invent that or if it already exists, but this clinical understanding I think has not been helpful, because people will say, oh, I'm depressed, when what they actually might mean is I'm particularly sad today. Yeah. And that's not a one-to-one equivalence, right. But in the way that we talk about it, it seems that way. So
no.
I don't want to go too far down that.
That's the really frustrating thing, because then I mean, there's a ton of topics that are struggling with that same kind of issue of just a lack of nuance, I guess, talking about any sort of issue. Most of the social issues I think we're trying to discuss right now, I think this is my current theory anyways, that like for some reason, and maybe it's just my own personal narrative of just becoming a young adult and starting to feel like I have to pay attention to social issues a little bit more. But I feel like
part of it for sure.
there's a sense of like, I think there's too many issues on my plate anyways. Maybe I can't speak for everyone, but maybe I can a little bit as somebody who's part of everyone.
You're right. You are part of everybody.
Right. But
everyone includes you.
When
sometimes
there's like expectation to have an opinion on everything, especially I mean, the everythings that are important to us now, or that are showing up in the news and on social media and stuff, these are like institutions, or these are like practices. These are difficult things, like things you actually can be an expert on and have a technical discussion of, like talking about politics, or talking about medical development, talking about mental health, talking about like or economics, or like redistribution, or race theory. I don't know. There's so many topics that were sort of asked to have and you have to have the correct opinion of these things, or else you might run into some serious trouble when you're living in the massive room of people pointing and ready to judge at somebody called the internet, right?
Right.
It's like you have to suddenly have an opinion on all these things, but you don't obviously don't have the time to actually think through your opinion on all these things, because there's way too many of them, and they would require you to actually do it full time.
I mean, potentially. Right? Like, yeah, I think perhaps two things that maybe come to mind. We'll see if it's only two things, but I think what you're describing, at least in part, is twofold. One is a lack of critical thought, right? And that's not to say that people are stupid. I think that people are lazy thinkers, right? Which is a very different thing than intellect.
I'm afraid that like people wouldn't have been as lazy as they were encouraged to be by being given such a large problem to deal with. I think if you scale up the difficulty of the problems that you give people gradually, and I mean that's has a lot to do with, like, you know, creating a video game that people actually want to play. You really have to pay attention to that. What do you call it? The difficulty curve, right? Something like that. It's like, I don't think we've been paying attention to scaling our difficulty curves when it comes to like interacting with social issues.
Well, to be fair, I'm not sure if I'd go so far as to say that that's quite the case. I think perhaps what you might be describing there is merely just the frequency of messaging. And I think that it's perhaps more that than the actual difficulty of the subject itself. Like, I don't think that subjects are any more complex today than they were 100 years ago, right? They're as challenging to try and parse out and adequately navigate, partly why they still exist today, right? Like, they're challenging subjects to deal with. But more, like you just described, an enormous list of varied subjects, all of which I would say are pressing issues in our culture today, right? It's not to say that they weren't before,
right?
But, you know, issues of
I
race
think the key
equity,
difference is just the stakes are higher in this moment, because the potential lashback you can get is not just the person you're talking to in front of you saying, that's a dumb idea. It's everyone. Like, you're connected to a massive, sprawling social network.
Right. And so actually, the point that I was endeavoring to make about just sort of lazy thinking, I think it's actually connected. No, not at all. Not at all. This is great stuff. But yeah, the point a little bit about lazy thinking, it's not so much that people are inactive out of a sense of like not caring or apathy outright, right? But I would say more exhaustion. And I think it's connected to this thing that you're talking about here with, you know, if you're exposed to these ideas of such magnitude with such frequency, right? Like, we're here talking about probably daily in your newsfeed, you're seeing something political, something ideological, something that's, you know, touching on this is unjust or not right? So the frequency of that messaging, I think, makes people a little bit calloused to engaging it, right? Otherwise, you'd be heartbroken, right?
Yeah.
So it's not to say that people aren't engaging the issues. I think that people are, but I also think that messaging frequency makes people tune a deaf ear or turn a deaf ear to it sometimes, or they just can't be bothered, right? So you kind of raise it. Well, what's the point? There's too many things to deal with, right? So I'm gonna, you know, I saw these headlines, I'm not gonna think too much about it. Hence the laziness. So I think that they're definitely connected factors, but they're so STEM focused, so science focused,
totally,
that we're analytical to a fault in a lot of areas, and we forget the nuances of just humanity, right? That what does it mean to be human? That is probably the biggest question of the day. Yeah. But schools are not addressing it because schools are
not even attempting to wrestle with it.
Well, and to be like, I empathize, like, to an extent. Admittedly, I have very strong and also very negative views of education these days as a whole, and I have to be careful about how intensely I come across with that stuff, because truth be told, like, we were just describing the struggles that, you know, teachers and politicians and so on have to make simple curriculum changes, right? So the institution is slow to react, or to respond, we should say, to the needs of a society. So there has to be grace across the board for how curriculums get built and what decisions get made. So with that disclaimer said, I'm really disappointed with what I see in the core subjects, if we call them that. English is one subject right? One subject area, and that comprises grammar, language arts altogether, story, creative writing and fiction, literature, poetry, spelling, and any other remotely linguistic concept.
I remember trying to understand what was English in like middle school and high school. It's like, wait, these aren't separate subjects. This is all just English?
Well, it's lumped together. Like I would look at that. Look at the favoritism towards STEM subjects, right? And you'll notice the disparity immediately, right? So STEM, if listeners don't know, is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So those 4 key subject areas, all of which happen to relate to science, technology. Like anyway, whatever.
Sure.
Where jobs are, it makes sense that they would be focused the way that they are. There's a lot of demand for jobs in those skills, but they don't address questions of the nature of humanity, philosophical ponderings, yearnings for something more, all of those kind of, fundamental storytelling components of the human experience as far back as our history allows us to know. So those questions are missing. So when you lump all that together in just English class, right? And I'm here not saying that yes, these subjects exist in some schools. They'll have philosophy or fiction writing, whatever. They aren't core. So the classes that every person going through school has to take, English is the only class that involves like deliberately critical thinking and artistic ideological formation. Like you're dealing more with the process than the result. An essay is more about how you construct an argument than whether or not you're right. Right. So it's not results oriented; it's process oriented.
Or creativity almost oriented.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's the only place, but it's certainly one of the only places that you see that done in a very deliberate way. And even then, I wouldn't say it's done sufficiently, but nonetheless, English class, that takes place. Most other places, it doesn't. So you're dealing more with, do I know the information? Do I have the right equation, right? Or even in history, a lot of the time, you can get swept up into sort of weird straw man rewritings of the discipline, or else just trying to pass the tests. Do I have the dates? Do I have the information that I need, right? English class, it doesn't matter, right? How well you know the story or whose names were what. Maybe there's some points to that, but the big marks are, did you write an essay that makes sense, right? So sorry, I was trying to make a point about the actual disparity between the course's offerings. So just, for example, consider that science, if you just had science as a subject, people would think you're mad, right?
Right.
Imagine, I have science
There's so
class.
many sciences.
Well, no, I've got 1 week on physics, 1 week on chem, 1 week on biochemistry, which is a separate maybe, one week on
really,
ecology.
we ought to include math is part of science too. So you cover math real quick in 1 week too.
Maybe 3 days on math. It's nonsense, and we laugh. We think, oh, that's so foolish. But that's what we've done to, grammar, rhetoric, oratory, composition, right? Poetry, philosophy. Like those concepts are missing, and you could take the English
and I think
nut
because
and crack it
it's
1,000 ways.
Not nearly as easy to generate revenue based on those things. Like there's the classic idea of the starving artist is like that's what the capitalist boomer says about any of the arts is just, oh, don't do the arts, you're going to be starving. There's no money in that. And it is a real problem because it's not as easy to like, for some reason, I mean, because art's mass produced and it's not just like, because art, I guess because art is digital. It's mass produced without almost any cost for like, as far as there's no production cost, basically. There's a very small production cost, but you can virtually, if you write the best song, everybody in the world can have the best song. It's not just people in proximity of you. If you make really good butter, the people around you who can buy your butter.
Right. So there is definitely an intrinsic pragmatism, just sort of a practicality to how people think when it comes to these things. But it's nonetheless interesting. I would just sort of supplement that analysis that I actually agree with and despise at the same time. I hate that it's true. And yet, who are the highest paid individual persons in sort of public knowledge, right? Like, we might be able to name a couple billionaires that we happen to know about, but largely speaking, we're here talking about athletes and musicians, if maybe these days less musicians, but certainly movie actors, right? Large, big name actors. These are household names, people that we know, faces that we know. incredibly successful, well-paid individuals, right?
Right.
The industry as a whole, there's a tremendous amount of just practical money in that, right? And those are, I would say, yeah, they're mostly entertainment, but
It's
still,
just that the Pareto distribution has totally
Yes.
taken over that industry, where literally the
Absolutely.
top 1% gets all of the revenue and everybody else shares, or gets 99% of the revenue, and that last 1% of a very profitable industry has to, the 99% has to share that 1% of additional revenue, which is still, I mean, I'm getting by.
Sure. But so there's a few things that emerge, kind of framework that takes place in order for somebody to become world famous in the first place. Yet there's still a very, if not lucrative, a very real music scene or culture of a particular area or region of the world. I think of places like, I don't know, Germany just comes to mind, that have very specific expressions of folk music or whatever. There's very distinct cultural markers, right? In places like North America, where our culture is a little bit newer, a little bit less tried and true, you could say. It's a more recently settled area with whatever. Don't need to bore you with all that history, but the premise here is that those cultural markers have not been set in stone the same way. So in North America, it's kind of a make it or break it, right? You have to be big everywhere or you're big nowhere, right? That's sort of how we engage with things these days. Certainly these days. It might have been true before, right? You have to make it in LA or New York or both if you ever actually want to be a celebrity, I suppose. But all I mean to say is that there definitely is a lucrative component to artistry of a kind, right? It granted, probably isn't everybody, right? But not every entrepreneur is the Jeff Bezos, and it's odd that we would compare them to that, right? It's a little bit bizarre that our concept of, we have to be world famous to be successful, right? That deters most folks from encouraging somebody to pursue art of a kind. And I here mean art very broadly. I don't mean visual art or whatever. I mean things like, poetry, dance, drama, music, sculpture, philosophy, even just, I don't know, even something like this. I would call this art, right?
Yeah.
So it's things like that I think get a shaft because we think of them as impractical, which is just, I think, is a lie. I think it's well, I mean, you brought up the point that, you're getting by and you can make it, and yet these people will disparage, artists as a whole.
Right. And it's like, and I'm not getting by because I've got a big following on Patreon that's paying me a certain amount of money per, which that's become a model that's worked for some musicians, but it forces you then you have to become a sort of a musical cover populist, where you just write the sort of music that people are willing to pay monthly for, because they want to hear covers of their favorite pop songs. And it's like, if I want to engage in sort of genuine classical singer-songwriter, folk musician artistry, I can't really do that unless I'm the top 1% of best people at doing that.
Right. And I think that, to me, that signals not so much that, these things are bad and shouldn't be done because, and most people probably aren't saying that they're bad, but they would imply that they're not something that ought to be pursued in a professional sense. Yeah.
But I think thinking about this problem is really important, because this is how content markets work, especially. And if that's where almost especially, this is what's terrifying to me, is that this is where our religious communities are heading as well. And then
have headed, probably, if we're talking in the United States, for sure.
Yeah, I had a friend recommend me to read this book about kind of the history of the evangelical church, and he traces this trend all the way back to like the 1700s. Anybody wants to specifically tie it to the separation of church and state, which is, in his mind, that was kind of the beginning of the church and the gospel beginning to enter into a free market rather than an established hierarchy of like teachers and who trusts who and stuff like that. And as soon as you apply a free market to almost anything, that's where the Pareto distribution problem takes over, right? Suddenly, those who, it's like there's no. Well, I mean, I guess I've thought about this problem from a couple different angles, but it's just like it becomes about who's best at presenting their material, not who has the most meaningful material. And when it comes to
substance, it's about popularity, right?
Exactly. And so if church is becoming content, if spiritual connection and understanding God, philosophy, all these things, these are all of the sort of the art disciplines, all of the, I don't know, how do you want to categorize it? Sorry?
The humanities.
The humanities.
Term,
okay.
right?
Yeah.
So,
all of the humanities
and the sciences
are becoming taken over just by people who are good marketers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would suggest that they've been reduced to that, not so much taken
reduced
over
to marketing,
as,
exactly, because it's okay.
And
how do you, like, if for one thing, do you see it that way, and if so, how do you solve a problem like free market distribution?
Well, I think that so and as bleak as some of this conversation has been, there's also, I think, a lot of hope, or at least glimmers of hope that give me a bit of pause and I don't know, I guess levity maybe is the word. Like I see glimpses of things and I go, okay, wait, there's something to this. But first let me backtrack. So yes, I do see it that way. I think that we severely underestimate the degree to which marketing has affected the way we think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that that's a really significant point that probably merits its own exploration outright. But definitely, like, Madison Avenue advertising, you want this consumer-driven economies and all kinds of things over the past maybe 50, 60 years is huge in just how, as a population, like across the globe, we all think of things. It's very different than it used to be.
Yeah.
So that's a really, I think, significant part of all this. In terms of how do we fight that, or if fight's not really the right word, how do we sort of resist?
How do we course correct, anyways?
Yeah, or how do we navigate, right, the situation that we found ourselves in as a society? And it's not an easy answer. I don't know that I have a good answer, but things that give me hope are things like, millennials and below in particular, who seem to care a lot about things like supply chain ethics, right? That's something that is huge in my I'm hugely convicted about. Like, it's something I really want to pay attention to and do where possible. I try to pay attention to, but I'm woefully ignorant when it comes to how all that stuff works. And yet there's a deep desire to know more. Right. So holding companies accountable for how their shoes get made, right? Yeah. Stuff like that. There's sort of this grasp.
It's just weird because suddenly this is a problem. I don't feel, I mean, I think it used to be harder to get away with the amount of large scale corruption that institutions are almost just like, it's considered the norm because it's so easy to externalize our misdeeds. Basically, it's like we can run a really pristine looking Walmart in America and have all of the products made in a, I don't know if Walmart is specifically a source of this bad scenario, but like you can run a really, really beautiful looking business that looks just totally like fine on the outside, looks like everybody's happy and smiling and everybody's happy with their work conditions, and have all the products be totally outsourced to another country, totally taking advantage of their, more lax labor laws. And it's like, there's not a visual connection because it's literally somewhere else. It's so far disconnected. Like the final destination, the actual interaction, the face-to-face interaction with the institution is so disconnected from their actual practices that it's very difficult to, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but you're...
Oh, no, not at all. No, it's a good point. I think you're describing, it's a sign of the times, right? We live in a world so categorized by greed and really consumerism, like this idea that I need to buy things or have what's the Walmart logo, right? It's save money, live better. Right. So really just like full on playing into this idea of greed and I want more stuff for less money. Right. I mean, that's another way to phrase that same thought. Right. But anyhow, I think that you're speaking to the fact of, the disconnect. It's this duality or even duplicity to how we engage society. And I think corporations are really just reflecting what's already the case in most of our personal value systems anyway. Right? Whether we like it or not, all of us probably live very duplicitous lives without intending to. We live one way or say one thing, and then in a different context or a different account or whatever it is, we have a very different way of living or operating or thinking or something to that degree.
Which the less intimate we have to be with our peers, the more walls we're able to hide behind, the more we give ourselves an easy space to be duplicitous.
Well, it's accountability, right? Like, are you actually accountable to the people or not? If you're not, well, I can get away with whatever. What are the consequences? Who cares?
But like, there's when you're the people that you're serving and the people that you're employing, the people that you're interacting with through your business endeavors and through your life endeavors, you literally are face-to-face interacting with them. They can read your micro communications. They can see when you're uncomfortable, when you're being dishonest, or when you're like, there's a forced accountability when you're interacting with the people that you're serving or that are your clients. But when we have so much of it, it's like we've spread ourselves out to be as big as the entire globe. Every single person, their personality extends because of the abilities through the internet. We have it's such an easy and such an alluring position to just externalize all the bad stuff that you don't want people to see, put on a nice face, and it's like I don't know. It seems maybe I'm just whining, but like it feels like it's easier to be within religious terms. It's easier to just be a really sinful jerk, and it's getting easier. We're building the scenario to encourage people to be crappy.
Maybe. I suppose I would look at it that, again, I don't think that people have really changed all that much, right? I'm not by any means cynical in that respect. I don't think
it's the people. Like, I'm wondering about the environment.
Well, no, for sure. So, notwithstanding, the climate, I guess, if you want to call it that, and pun intended, is very different than perhaps it once was. But people fundamentally have very similar themes that sort of govern our behavior, our motives, our interactions with one another. And I don't know that I would say, for example, that the North America of 2021 is somehow more corrupt than the North America of 1921, right? I would say they're probably very similar, and it's not so much a matter of substance, but of degree, right? Or even just like it's the same stuff. It's just, how loud is the volume, right? There's something to the idea that Bezos, for example, could be this, trillionaire or whatever his wealth has accumulated to in the seconds we've been talking. He's made billions of dollars probably, but somebody like that could exist. That concept feels very different because it's extreme. It's magnified to sort of the nth degree, but that's no different than a Warren Buffett back in the 70s, or then Rockefeller back at the turn of the century, right? It's a very wealthy mogul who capitalized on an opportunity, and people do that, right? So I think that in that respect, there's a lot of kind of nasty bits to things that we're aware of. And again, I think the internet has, in some ways, been more of a curse than a blessing in this regard. We're aware of all this extra corruption to the point we get tired of hearing it. We get worn to it. We get raw to the idea. But at the same time, there's all kinds of really interesting stories that are the flip side of that likewise benefit from the medium. And so if let's not harp on the internet too much. It's a tool, and a hammer can be a weapon or a construction implement depending on how you use it, right? So the tool here, the internet, is fine in its own right. It's a question of how does it get applied, right? And to what degree does it get reined in? And really probably the bigger pervasive question around, the internet as a whole is, how do you govern a system that's by definition interconnected to every jurisdiction on the planet, right?
But see, this is the thing, is so using the tool analogy, I think is great. It's just that, like, even really, really simple comparison with a 5-year-old child, the knife that you give them, that you're willing to let them experiment with and learn how to use, is significantly duller than the knife that you would let a surgeon use.
For sure.
Right? But the knife that everybody has, there's no barrier to entry. Everyone has the maximum ability to, well, not maybe the maximum, but it's like there's no scaling of responsibility.
Right. A 13-year-old is as pronounced or prominent potentially as a 35-year-old or a 90-year-old.
Or there are 7-year-olds who have 30 million subscribers on YouTube.
Sure.
And it's like, that is, I guess, I don't know, historically there's people who are in royalty, and maybe this is the new version of royalty.
It's not unlike that,
right? But,
it's not unlike that.
But it seems that there's, I don't know.
No, it's an absolute, like, for sure. Like, let's not by any means underplay the degree to which the internet has shifted society. Like
Right.
we absolutely can't, right? And actually, even more than the internet is really the smartphone. The smartphone
Yeah.
is to society a force probably on par or greater than the Industrial Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Which, if you're not a big history buff, when people figured out how to use coal to make steam engines,
Yeah.
the world changed pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the smartphone has done that for society in a way that I don't think we can fully appreciate, potentially even in this century.
Right.
But that's a tale for other historians to tell. It's it's all very, very messy. But I think ultimately, like I was sort of mentioning, that there are still these glimmers of hope in what we would call a very bleak climate. People are able to make, say, individual products. So to go back, to the supply chain example, if we were to just sort of stick with that for the sake of continuity, yes, like supply chains are incredibly corrupt in a way that we're now very aware of, right? And maybe people are trying to figure out that more and be more mindful. Well, the internet is a place that has allowed for people to think more locally in a very accessible way, right? So I'm able to find out, is there a local food shop that sources things locally more or less in my area? Yeah, sweet. It's actually around the corner from my apartment.
Right.
Awesome, right?
Yeah.
So there are...
The biggest, sorry, I don't want to harp on this too long. I have other stuff I want to talk to you about too. But
yeah. Let's.
I guess I view it through the lens of, okay, we weren't expecting a pandemic like this. Some people who actually studied this sort of thing, like epidemiologists, were expecting it, but I wasn't.
Sorry, but before you jump into that, I do want to absolutely let you continue. But just, you mentioned people expecting it. There is an eerie video of Obama, actually, like maybe 10 years ago, talking about this very thing, right? So he was taking flack from reporters about the sorry, this is totally like derailing things here.
Yeah, no. I love this.
There's a he was taking flack from a reporter, if I understand the context correctly, about that task force that he made, that he and Biden made, that was supposed to prepare the United States for a global catastrophe of this kind. Right, that got disbanded by the Trump presidency within its first year in office, I believe. So there's a video of him taking questions from reporters where he's saying, like, could be a situation where we're going to have a deadly airborne, contagion that's potentially, anyway. If you watch that in like 2020 and you're like, holy crap, like,
yikes. Yeah. Well, see,
it's a surreal moment.
What I'm concerned about is that I feel like at this point, especially with the very real example we have of the year 2020, it should not be difficult at all to prophesy that any sort of virus that wants to get around can. Our networks are way too connected. We have no meaningful way of dealing with viral sicknesses when they come up. If COVID had actually been really bad, we would be really, really screwed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to be fair, it is really bad.
I would say if it had been, very physically,
if it was like Ebola level.
Yeah, sure. That's what I mean by bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say,
but no, like, I would say that the length of this lockdown, as frustrating as it's been, is actually, I think, a testament to humans' ability to cooperate. As frustrating as it's been with anti-maskers and vaccine questions now that people are asking, and I get really tired of it, admittedly, but like in Ontario at the very least, the government was overwhelmed by the response of the population, who said, okay, we're going to cooperate, right? Overwhelmingly so, to the point that they actually undermined their opinion among the population because things didn't get as bad as it should have gotten, because people were willing to actually participate. So anyway, just a silver lining, maybe.
To quickly, like, I wonder if maybe part of the difference between Canada and the States' response to this situation is that Canada has a smaller population, so we might have a deeper sense of a connection to our government, because it's like, I don't know, that's just a really loose thought, but
well, I mean, how far down that rabbit trail do you want to go? But
yeah, really, I have somewhere else I actually wanted to go with this. But so as far as, like, apparently Obama was expecting the pandemic.
Someone saw it coming.
But this is like, it's obvious that, okay, if we get a sufficiently viral virus going, and we have supply chains that are global, and nobody is independent on any front, or almost any front. Like we're more connected than we've ever been, and at higher speeds than have ever been before, right? Mm-hmm. Then viruses, if they're bad and they're contagious, they just spread to everyone. And so picking up that little plot that we have of the map and setting it down on the other map of our mimetic evolution, any sufficiently viral idea spreads way, way faster than anybody can contain it. This is our problem with fake news. This is our problem with, I mean, it's the problem with the music industry too, as far as like, a few people taking over everything. But it's like the few most viral, the few ideas that know how to market themselves best, whether or not they're extremely dangerous, spread way, way more quickly than rationality or intuition can manage to slow things down. And it's like,
that's true.
The only barrier, or the only way I see of slowing things down, again, and that's maybe we can use this as kind of a little segue, because I think the only way dumb ideas get sanded down from my own head is by sitting down and having long chats with friends.
Sure.
I think there's just, at least I can say from my life, maybe I can speak from everyone's life, but I need to talk to people more, and I need to learn how to listen better, and I need to learn how to talk better.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that actually speaks to something we touched on before, which is this charitability piece, right? The willingness to hold your own ideas in suspense while you charitably and critically engage somebody else's perspective, right? Whether or not you agree doesn't necessarily matter. It's, did you give them a fair go? Did they, have a decent chance to hear? And did you listen? Right. All of those kind of conversational bits.
That's sort of analogous to the incubation period of the virus. It's like, if you just let it sit a little bit longer, like with people who are getting COVID, it's like it takes 2 weeks, whatever, to know whether or not you for sure had it, right? Mm-hmm. Or you might have symptoms or whatever, right? I think that kind of maps on a little bit to the conversation thing, because if you have an idea and it sounds kind of quippy and funny when you first say it, but you spend 2 hours unpacking it, you figure out whether or not it's actually dangerous or not, or you at least you're more likely to figure that out, right? If you take some more time before spreading it again and giving it another chance to sort of reproduce, then you can slow down the spread. And you could be more likely to spread ideas that, with more of your being, you're certain are good ideas.
It's kind of like we are each other's ideological antibodies.
Right. Yeah, that's a good. But yeah, so well, I sent an email to you, whatever, a month ago or so. It took a while to figure out a good day to do this, geez. But you said that you had a similar idea, or like you were you felt compelled to try to solve a similar problem.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting. Like, it's actually really, it was uncanny receiving the email from you. And I was grinning ear to ear the whole time, because I'm like, this is just, while not by any means, I think the exact same, like, it's like, wow, this is resonating it's like adjacent. I don't know. That's a term that people use these days. If something's kind of like, oh, it's near
it's
it.
in the vicinity. It's kitty corner.
Yeah. Okay. No. Don't you harp on the kitty corner. That is a beautiful piece of Canadian slang that will forever. If something is right beside you but diagonal, yes, we have a phrase for it.
See, okay. I've actually taught so many young kids what the technical meaning of Fortnite is in the past year, because all of them think it's a video game.
Well, and to be fair, it is, and admittedly, it's probably more clever than I want to give it credit for, because you're building forts, and maybe I don't know, it's like night. Okay, yep. Fine. There's a pun maybe that's happening there, but yeah, sometimes it's really nice to have a phrase for 2 weeks from now.
Exactly, especially because a lot of the kids that I'm teaching, we have lessons bi-weekly, so I love to say, "I'll see you next fortnight."
See, but even that bi-weekly, isn't that technically incorrect? I think it is, and I forget. I remember exploring this one time, so I don't know. Maybe somebody can't cancel culture. Somebody correct me here. But no, the bi used to mean
twice weekly, maybe, right?
Twice, not half.
Right.
And so bi-monthly is what I'm talking about. I think bi-monthly should mean every 2 months, but now it's come to mean twice a month. Bi-monthly. People will say bi-monthly, and that will mean twice a month.
All right, that's very confusing. Yeah, because bi-weekly the way I use it anyways, and the way I understand it when people say it, is that it means every 2 weeks.
Every two, yeah. But it's bi-monthly, and that means like cut in half as opposed to doubled. Anyway, it's a weird. Somewhere someone started doing that, and it's common enough. Anyway, somebody,
okay.
Send me an email saying, "Excuse me, actually, it's not that." And board warriors. Anyway,
what was it? Okay, it was your idea was adjacent to mine. It was kitty corner.
Yeah. So there's a so really these two ideas that I've already sort of touched on that I feel are pervasive issues, but largely I would say that a lot of the disagreements that people have, or I would even say perceived disagreements, because it's not always actually substantial. It's more in language than it is in like substance.
Great. Yeah.
I think that a lot of that goes back to probably a lot of what we've mentioned here. Fundamentally critical thinking and charitability, and I think that those two things tend not to coexist oftentimes, particularly as it's expressed in the most, I think, important medium, which is conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Conversation skills are just not something that are taught the same way. And I would say because so much engagement or just social interaction continues to be happening in a primarily text-based format, right? I'm not sure that we fully appreciate the degree to which these skills have eroded, culturally speaking, right? It's a really interesting just sort of subdivision, even as a very broadly here, as a cross-section of society, the difference between urban communities and rural. There's a very big cultural divide there to this day, right? But one of the very interesting, maybe more kind of pronounced differences is this conversationality, right? If you're in the city, if you try to strike up a passing conversation with someone, that is creepy as hell.
That's how you could tell whether or not you're in a city or a village, if whether or not people wave to you when you walk down the street.
And so there's sort of there's a lot of reasons why that could be, and we could spend ages trying to parse all that out. But my point there is that there's sort of this relic almost of a time gone by, it feels, right? Whether that's because it's rural or older people tend to live in rural communities, perhaps, and that's where that skill set tends to be. I don't know that I could isolate it, but nonetheless, there's something just so beautiful when you go ahead.
So, I mean, I had the thought, like, it really seems to me that it's some sort of overstimulation or inundation syndrome of like when you give people like I've thought a lot about, and I'm kind of frustrated by the problems of cities, because there's obviously so much that becomes possible when you gather that many people in one space, and so much wealth that can be accumulated, and so much industry that can happen. But the downside is that it's impossible to care about your whole city. Like there's too many people, because your city isn't just, it isn't buildings, it's people. And you can't care about that many people. You can think about a number and say, I care about 1,000 people, but you can't actually care about that many people. Like individuals.
You can care about them, you can't care for them, if we can make that distinction, right? Like I can abstractly say, I think human lives matter, these are humans, I care about them, right? Abstractly, but I can't have this kind of intimate, or even not even intimate, but even just casual acquaintance to the degree that I
compared to the other relationship that is intimate. Right? It's just even talking to somebody, even looking them in the eye. True. That's a much deeper level of intimacy than what's expected in a city atmosphere.
No, you're right. No, it is a good point. Notwithstanding, it's part of the reason why I increasingly am trying to think more like neighborhood by neighborhood. Like I've been on kind of a bit of a crusade in my own way of thinking about. Oh gosh, so many things, but even take patriotism, right? That's a very big, fancy word that people might throw around positively or negatively, depending on your view. I don't know. I've always found it a little bit bizarre that I'm, as a Canadian, right? I have some weird sense of connectedness to British Columbia, which is a continent away, right? It's very arbitrary, right? They've got their own sort of culture. Culture, I guess, is really more my point here. I think that there's cultures and then there's subcultures, and increasingly we've tried to, I think we compare ourselves to a shared cultural norm or a hypothetical cultural norm that is based on what we see and are exposed to, and we assume that most people are exposed to that. But it's just not the case. Most of the time, our engagement with culture is so individualized on our phones that we are very out of touch. So I've been trying to think more, what are the actual physical, geographic things that unite a particular community, right? So actually, I'll venture down this aside because I think that it connects to this idea about cities, though I don't know how long we're going to camp here. But
no, this is exactly what I really need some help processing this idea right now. So any insight you have, please share.
Well, let me get ready here. But no, so one of the things that that my church is actually in the process of doing is really rebuilding and reconceptualizing our entire premise of what it means to care about people that are connected with us. Right, so you're connected to new life. What does that mean, and what is care? Right? We're basically asking those questions and working backward from that to produce what we're calling at the moment, the working title is regional care model. It's really basically the parish church model, if you're at all familiar with that. But like, take a plot of land, divide that up by kind of boundaries that make some semblance of sense, and associate those groups together. So way back in the day, that's basically how Europe got divided. Like the church basically said, this river, that river, and that, created Germany and France as we understand them. That's way oversimplified, but, chop up the land and there, now you're connected to each other.
Yeah.
We're not trying to be quite that arbitrary, but the point is we're trying to firstly map all the different individuals that are connected to us. Like, actually, where do you specifically live, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is not something I think most churches actually bother to like get an image in their minds of, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a cool thing to do. Anyway, we're then grouping those based on neighborhoods that are defined by a slew of different criteria, but like major intersections that might split particular areas. Geographic things become easy, like rivers or whatever. So on one side of the river, that side. But it gets a little bit more nebulous in these really densely populated areas where a lot of our people live. What are the cultural dividing marks in those communities? And one of the things that took us maybe 3 or 4 days of me staring at this map to figure out was that there's actually an old train trail that runs in the middle of the town that I live in. Mm-hmm. And on the east side of that train trail, there's one sort of conception of what it means to live in Collingwood. On the west side, there's a slightly different one, right? I wouldn't say it's super pronounced, but it's a barrier that actually affects the way that people move and live in their community, to the degree that if you were to cut the line arbitrarily across another street or intersection, you'd be cutting the community in half without thinking about it, right? So I was really grateful to see that, but it's just an example of how I've been trying to pay even more attention. And I mean, like, the town that I live in is like 20,000 people, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not here talking about even a very large city. It's quite small, but in a hyper local way, what does it mean to be a part of a neighborhood, right? Not just generically, what does it mean to be a part of the region of the town that I live in? Or say it was, I don't know, I live in Toronto. No, it's not. I think that's maybe, it's not a bad question, but what does it mean to be somebody who lives at, like, Bayview and Steeles, right? Like not just, I live in North York, but like this major intersection. What are the major moving places or cultural centers of this sub-community of sub-communities, right? That's a conversation that I think is tremendously valuable. That's really, I wouldn't say that it isn't, it's just not prominent. There's no specific place that you can go to, I think.
And the way you have to engage with that problem isn't through an established data metric. It's through like a really intuition or creativity, or it's like you have to go and like be there and figure. It's like you have to be totally open to like what is the sense I get of what's uniting or unifying this area, like what.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So wisdom that I received from a very great friend and mentor of mine. Her name's Kathy McIntosh. She's a firecracker of a woman, incredibly passionate and just dedicated to everybody she cares about. Anyway, wonderful, wonderful woman. But she passed on this kernel of information. She probably stole it from someone else, but it's a simple phrase, bloom where you're planted, right? Mm-hmm. Simple enough idea. You've probably even maybe heard a variation of that before. Yeah. I've, of course, distilled that to my own way of communicating that truth, which is live where you're at, right? Which I prefer that somehow. There's a folksy yokelness to that I love. But it's really this idea that, we have access to a hyper digital, hyper globalized world, and that's not going away, right? Smartphones, the internet and smartphones in particular, it's an invention not unlike the automobile, right? It's changed society. Useful. Well, it simply has changed society, and you can't do anything about it. You might prefer the horse and buggy. It might even be more environmentally friendly and have all kinds of advantages. Doesn't matter, right? It's not going away, so we have to learn how to live with it, right? At the same time, though, that doesn't mean our lives have to be defined by it, right?
Right.
And I think that's the piece that I'm learning to rebel against a little bit in my own spirit. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not interested in just going along with an arbitrary set of. I shouldn't say that. I think location is just as arbitrary as anything, because anybody can just pack up and leave at any point, generally speaking, right? If you have the means, you can do that. But accepting its arbitrariness, you can't deny the fact that I live in the same area as these people, right? That's just a fact that everyone has to agree on, or you're in an asylum, right? You can't dispute that, right? It's not a matter of opinion. And in its own awkward way, that almost creates the ideological basis for something kind of beautiful, right? Like, this is my actual neighbor, right? It's not some random person on the internet, right? This person lives beside me. Whether I like that person or not, I don't get to just leave because I don't like my neighbor.
And there's practical implications to them being your neighbor.
Oh, sure. But I mean, even just like, if we want to call it a remedy for some of the things that we're talking about here, this lack of connectedness to people or the ability to hide behind certain masks, there's an almost uncanny vulnerability to acknowledging the people that live near you, right?
Yeah.
You can't get away from that. They know that, like, I mean, my wife and I, we live above a church, which is bizarre. It's not the church I live at or work at, sorry. So I rent an apartment that used to be the residence for the church pastor that, anyway, it's very awkward. Wow. So our whole lives are steeped in not-for-profit everything. So anyway, but so we have this terrible habit, because of where our entrance is, of driving past our waste bins after garbage day and forgetting about them, because we don't look out our front windows very often, and you drive past them, you've got a kid to get in the house and so on, right? So then suddenly it's Tuesday and you haven't, like, it's lockdown, we don't walk outside very often or whatever, right? So finally we look and we're like, oh shit, we forgot our bins out again, right? Well, you know, the church that lives beneath us, like, they know that that's our problem, and they might have their own issue with that, and they're like, you know, get a text, hey, by the way, your bins are out on the front, take care of that, right? There's an apartment building beside us, they know that we're the people who live there, so there's all the, like, there's a rawness to that almost, right? So here's this weird, quirky, dumb thing that my wife and I have a habit of, you know, forgetting to do, that, I don't know, people can notice, right? Right. But at the same time, there's a beautiful opportunity there too, where you can actually try at the very least and get to know the people that live nearby you, and you've got an in. Oh, hey, I live in this house over here, right? What's to stop you? You know, like, anyway, I understand that in its own right feels very awkward and intimidating to some, but all I mean is that that's an opportunity for you to hold something in common with someone, which, again, like, I think common ground or lack of common ground is one of the larger problems with this charitability issue, right? We villainize anybody that is seen as being in the opposite camp or a different camp than the one we've chosen to be in, right? Well, how do you vilify a neighbor who lives beside you? You live in the same neighborhood, right? You chose the same plot of land. You're separated by 10 meters, right? Whatever, 15 yards, whatever it is, right? Like, I don't know. I feel like there's such a tremendous amount of value or potential in that. It's kind of like this this gem we've been sitting on all this time that we didn't notice, right?
Well, it's that's that sort of like accountability that's built into the structure, where it's not like it's right there. It's very, you're not getting. I mean, you can sort of hide behind, like, you're not as able to how would you say to curate the behavior that's available for those people to judge.
That's right.
They see whatever's there
altogether,
right?
Like, just block your windows, build a wall,
right? Which they're going to judge you for that too. So
sure,
there's no getting around it. These people are gonna judge you in a more intimate way, and there's two sides of it, because you don't just want everybody having the most intimate access to your life that they can constantly be judging you. That's really bad too. That's the other side of the social media conversation, where the first generation of people using Instagram and Facebook, and still some people who haven't quite figured out the trend, used it to, like, post and talk about every single piece of the most intimate bits of their life. Pictures, video, text about what they had for lunch. Who cares? I don't care about you enough to have a positive judgment or to have a meaningful judgment of that behavior. This is way too much content for me. But it's just like, you don't want to have people who, I mean, for one thing, it's just like, if you're friends on Facebook, that's a pretty, like, general kind of acquaintance level friendship. But it's just like learning the boundaries of what information do you share with your acquaintances versus people you care about. Well, you filter that based on how much they care about you. Because the sort of the worse or the more difficult problem or the more taboo problem you want to deal with, and you need somebody else's perspective to have on it, you need to have a sort of assurance that they actually care about you in solving this problem, and they're not just in it for some juicy gossip or in it for whatever. Like, sensitive information needs to be shared, but it needs to be shared with sensitive people.
Yeah, it's well put, for sure.
And so it's like, but we've lost, or we've just kind of forgot that that's important. And we have, maybe maybe just talking from my perspective again, it's like, I wasn't connected that deeply to any community. And this is the church thing, is like, I really think church is important, like the community aspect of church, even like being personally connected to the person who's teaching me and giving me spiritual insight. That's obviously important. I'm still struggling with the dynamic between that and just being able to find better public speakers and deeper thinkers on the internet. But like, I don't exactly know how to solve that problem. It's probably just a discipline thing too. Actually, I don't really care for some of the things that Bruxy Cavey is all about, but he said a couple of nuggets of wisdom that have stuck with me. And I just blanked my mind because I was thinking about how much I don't like Bruxy Cavey.
He's a great guy, by the way. incredibly humble considering his stature.
Yeah. No, he's honestly, I think he's a really, really, like, as far as personal character wise, very gifted
teacher.
Yeah, and a very gifted teacher, sure. What was I just saying though before I got sidetracked?
You had a couple nuggets of wisdom that really stuck with you.
Before that, though, what were the nuggets of wisdom relating to? This is my problem here.
Relating to accountability and being able to find just a better teacher online, for example, and how do you stay connected to a community? The importance of that, and the need for it when you can actually just reach any old place. Well,
I forgot the nugget.
Well, it didn't stick that well then, did it?
I guess not.
It'll come back to you, I'm sure.
Maybe. But bring us back on track now, because my brain's blanked.
Oh, well, I mean...
I'm sorry to throw that on you, but...
No, that's okay. Well, we were just chatting about, the idea of locality, the importance of community, privacy was a big point there. So sensitivity of information and how you actually share that versus when you shouldn't, right? Is that none of that's helping at all?
No, I'm saying just start unpacking some of your own thoughts if you have some, because I might need a while to get back where I was.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I mean, I guess on the subject of locality, one of the thoughts that was sort of sitting on my mind on the back burner was that the thing that we're describing here, we're like, oh, hey, you're my neighbor, I'm your neighbor. We have a vested interest in one another prospering, or in the community that's shared or whatever. One of the things that's a flaw in this is that people in general, big brush here, people in general struggle to make conversation, right? So we're fine with trivial things like the weather and whatever, but the moment it becomes a little bit more real, that intimacy piece, perhaps, when it affects us personally, that's when our guards get up and we become very distrusting, I think, of one another, such that we don't know always how to have a very charitable conversation, certainly not if it's a difficult subject matter, right? So that's one of the things that actually ties back to this podcast thing that I had in my brain, right? Which is that how cool would it be to have it? I don't know if I had thought of it as a podcast or like a sequence of YouTube videos that was effectively just a video podcast or whatever. But how cool would it be to model, right? To very deliberately model conversation skills in a way that can be studied by people. So you're not just like you're not just having the conversation, but you're educating viewership or your audience base as they participate in it with the skills that you're employing, right? Like whether that's like, I don't know if you ever watched The Emperor's New Groove, right? Did you ever see that movie?
Yeah, I love that movie.
Dude, that movie is probably responsible for my personality, if I'm being honest. I saw that as an impressionable young like preteen, and I was like, I want to be as funny as David Spade. Not that I knew it was David Spade, but anyway, I'm like, I want to do that. But that moment where he interrupts himself to like narrate on his own situation, right? I don't know why that gag I thought was just so funny as a kid. It's like, oh, he's going out and interrupting. It was just meta, and he's like drawing on people's faces, and just anyway. But maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's something like that. Like you have this chance where you're having a talk, and then you pause and like, okay, now pay attention to what this person's going to do. Or maybe you even just like break the fourth wall altogether, and we're having this conversation. We say, oh, okay, hold on. I don't know. I thought that something
Yeah.
like that would be an interesting tool to help,
Definitely.
just to encourage people that conversation doesn't have to be tricky,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah, you can get into sticky situations, but gosh, worst thing that happens is you end up disagreeing,
Right.
and at worst case scenario, you would disagree and you understand that person a little bit better, right?
That's not even the worst case scenario. That's probably the best case scenario. You go and actually dig deep enough to find where you disagree.
Maybe. All I mean to say is that, like, if somebody really, like, if you can't come to any kind of an agreement on a difficult subject, right? If you can't reach that point where, oh yeah, here's the truth and we agree. Excuse me. If you can't do that, like, the worst that happens is you voice an opinion, they voice an opinion. As long as you're charitable and a little bit critical with one another, like, you can measure or weigh that opinion and you walk away with something else to think about, right? And hopefully you understand the other person. If you've done your job, right? The part you can control, you know that person better than you did when you started chatting, right? How's that bad, right? How's that bad?
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I understand that maybe that person goes live and attacks you, but, like, let's not worry about
if you learn to do that job, like, part of it's just like exposure therapy, because if you just have gotten totally out of the habit of talking to anybody who disagrees with you about something, you forget the like, there should be kind of degrees of defense that you kind of feel out as you figure out how deep the disagreement has gone. And if you only have a really simplistic version of the situation in your head of, like, well, I mean, maybe talking about a political issue, if you have a very simplistic idea of, okay, people who like Trump are Nazis, or if you're on the other side, think people who like Biden are want to be
devil worshippers or whatever.
Yeah, devil worshippers, or are ultimately going to bring about some gulag camps or something like that. Like, if that's your only version of the story, it's because you haven't bothered to have a real conversation with a real person. You're having a conversation with an idea, and a strawman idea at that.
Yeah. Well, and again, I would say that the only two tools, and maybe that's a bold claim, but perhaps this is true. Like, the main two tools that I think are required for that activity to take place are critical thinking and charitability. If you can approach the other person.
Can you break down a little bit, more specifically, what do you mean by why is critical thinking versus, and what is charitability in that context?
Sure. I mean, I don't have, like, a Webster's definition of these traits myself.
I want Christopher's definition of those.
Yeah,
like, you're using these in a very practical way. They mean something to you.
They do. So we'll see if I can satisfy my own standard for what I mean by these words. Okay. You put me on the spot, but I love it. So when I say critical thinking, what I hear mean probably eclipses things like, or includes things like logic, and reasoning, argumentation. That's probably part of it, right? Being able to say, okay, here's an idea, right? Is this idea true as far as I can understand it? Right. And if you can if you can work your way down kind of through the sequence of, if this, then this, if this, then this. Yeah, that's definitely logic and perhaps difficult, but even there, like, questioning something, not just taking it for granted that what they said was the case, right? So what I mean here is you can't just be indoctrinated, right? Doctrine is far more common than we think. It's not purely a religious thing. Sound bites of politicians and so on, all of that by its nature is doctrinal. You're trying to sell a specific idea such that people don't challenge it, right? So here's a given. So doctrinal thinking, I'm very wary of, which is maybe a weird thing to hear from somebody who works in a church, but it's why the critical piece is so important to me. I think that you need to be able to be confronted with an idea and to be suspicious, to be skeptical, to even maybe venture into cynical, depending on the nature of it. Like, if somebody says Nazis are good, I'm like, pardon, right? Yeah. I'll okay, what do you mean by that? Right. But I'm cynical. I am not expecting to be persuaded, right? And also in critical thinking, I would probably add a caveat there that there are degrees of persuasiveness or persuasivity. That's not a word, but hey, we'll go with it. But for me, I make a very distinct and intentional difference between if I'm persuaded or if I'm convinced, right? So if I'm convinced, I mean, that is a high standard to beat, right? If I'm persuaded, it means, the needle's leaning in that direction, but give me more, kind of thing, right? I'm convinced. There's very few things in life I'd say I am convinced of. Right. Yeah. Now, whether or not I actually live out that standard I've just described in my own life, and how
Right. Those are the ideals anyways.
Precisely. So that's what I'm aiming for, at least as pertains to critical thought. So can I take an idea that's foreign to me, that's different from me, and be suspicious of it, right? In a way that is
can you break it down in a meaningful way?
Yeah. And then the charitability piece is the necessary companion to that concept, because I've met a lot of people. University is filled with critical thinkers. Well, that's not always true, but the school I went to was filled with a lot of critical thinkers. It was primarily humanities school. Yeah. So,
and one thing you're very good at this. Like within this conversation, I've noticed you building a branching outline of the conversation and following the connection of the thoughts to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's to me, that's sort of what it's building not just a bottom line of an idea, it's exploring the idea and figuring out how all of the pieces of it actually fit together in this branching structure of whatever the idea is.
It's an essay.
Yeah, it's an essay. And it has an outline.
So I remember, so to deviate back into the English conversation, but I hated essays so badly. Like holy hell, I could not get over how much essays suck. Well, because here's what it breaks down to. This is it seems to me at least, every children's experience ever. They start writing essays probably around 6th, 7th grade, okay? Mm-hmm. And what are, you raise your hand, and the keener in the class, which was probably me, let's be honest, raise your hand. Why do I need to do this? Right? Okay. And the teacher just sighs and says, you need to know how to do this for high school. Everyone goes, oh, that makes sense. Right? Okay. Then you shut up for 2.5 years. You finally get into high school, right? You're in grade 10 English. You're trying to teach you how to.
Why do I need to do this?
Why do we need that? And the teacher sighs, oh, you need to know how to do this for university, right? And then you get into university and you're like, okay, well, if somebody's bold enough at that point to raise and talk to the professor in front of 500 other people, they're just like, what do we need to do this? Like, we want to pass the class, don't you? And everyone laughs at their expense, right? And so on. Well, no, that's such a deficient, stupid way. Finally, in one of my more senior classes in university, a teacher just off the cuff made a statement about essays. And they're just like, yeah, well, essays are exercises in communication, right? And I went, oh, of course they are, right? Nobody said it that way. And that suddenly the light bulb goes off and I go, right, what I'm doing is I'm saying, here's what I need to tell you, right? And what's coming. So I'm priming people for what information they're about to receive. Hey, turns out that's a fundamental bit when it comes to communicating messaging on any product, right? Mm-hmm. Or any idea or any, even if I just, hey, I have something I need to tell you. Right. I have 3 things I want to say. Yeah. Thing 1, thing 2, thing 3. So this is the point that I've made. Right? Oh my goodness. Trying to overcome marital disputes when you finally understand how to communicate a thought in a clear manner. Right.
Well, and there's the total inversion of those principles too, that you need to learn how to build a good structure, and you need to analyze literature or analyze communication in a well-structured way, so that way you actually understand the person or the thing that you're interacting with. Right.
Well, and yeah, so I mean, there's definitely something to be said for just learning in general subject matter and being educated on a opinion you're choosing to have. So all of those are great skills, but just for me, when somebody okay, so I'm deviating fairly far here into this idea of, I guess, critical thinking and communication, but it's an important point, I think, that words matter. That's something I'll constantly come back to. Words matter. And there's a lot of ways I can unpack that, but the reason words matter is because people matter, right? Now, in an ideal world, okay, I would be able to take my brain and the thoughts that I'm having in it, and I'd be able to just beam them into your brain, right? And I don't know if Musk has his way, maybe that'll be possible. Who knows? Okay. But I want to be able to just take my idea and shove it into your head, and you understand my intent with a 1-to-1 equivalence. Except that can't happen. It's not possible.
Well, you don't even know what you mean yet.
Well, sure, but let's say that you can just get that. Let's imagine magically telepathy is possible and that happens, right? Okay. That would be ideal. There's 0 error between our communicative process, okay?
Yeah.
Instead, what we have to often do is use this vehicle, or numerous vehicles, but one of the main vehicles we use is called a word. Right? So what I'm doing is I'm taking my understanding of a concept, I'm finding language to support that concept, communicating that to you through this thing we call a word, which is a sequence of sounds culturally determined and beautiful and fascinating in their own right, sending that into your brain, which is then being interpreted into concepts and ideas that you're then, between your understanding of me and the place we're in, contextually, we somehow, we average out something that approximates understanding, right? Yeah. there is an enormous degree of variance in that possibility, right? But ultimately, if you're trying to express yourself to me and I to you, right? Words are one of the main ways that we have the opportunity to share in each other's existence, right? Which that's a very idyllic and beautiful way to describe it, but I genuinely believe that about language, right? So language is so much more than just this kind of medial task that we do on a daily basis out of necessity. It is that, but it's also this beautiful act of self-expression and exchange of ideas and information in a truly great way, right?
And not only that, but I even tie it to sort of an incarnation narrative, because
it could be.
Words are not even, I mean, ideas are not as specific a thing as words are, or as sentences are, or as essays are. Like,
it's true.
You'll come to many situations, obviously we both have in our lives, where like you think you have an idea and then you try to say it and you realize how dumb it is, or you realize, wow, that was a really incredible, I didn't even know that was coming. I didn't know I was going to say that. And it like pans out in a really meaningful and really specific. And it's like, when you start saying an idea, it becomes something totally, I mean, maybe totally is the wrong word, but it becomes something very different, and becomes like, it's of a different substance. Right? It's taking a concept which is it's like a very generalized, or it's like it's so generalized,
almost ethereal, right? It's this thing that almost doesn't exist in its own.
Right. Well, and like this is why I think about the Incarnation. It's like God, this incredible, massive, abstract thing coming down and compressing into something I can actually see, and I can experience in a way that I can process. And it's almost a, I mean, we can get into some theology stuff there if I go too far down that path, because I'm gonna say it's like it's reducing the infiniteness of God's character to something finite, right?
Or at the very least, giving you a touchstone on which to grasp those concepts, or to grasp that infinity.
And the other side of what I really like about even the Christmas story is that it's about, it's about coming down from the abstract or the massiveness of an idea and entering into somebody else's value structures. It's like God becoming man isn't just like spiritual thing becoming physical. That's what it is. But like the other side of it is that like humanity's current, or at the time that of Christ coming down and being with man, right? All those social structures, all of the cultural mores, all of the tastes of everybody who you're interacting with as Christ, like those don't necessarily, it's like they could be dumb, they could be foolish, they could be wrong, they could be evil, it's like he entered into all of those communities and basically paid attention to things that might be totally, from like a larger perspective, boring or meaningless or just dumb. But it's like when I don't know if I'm totally communicating this idea, but it's just like it's entering into somebody's value structures, entering into their language, entering into like the way they experience the world, despite whether or not it's the best vehicle for interacting with reality. It's like you enter into that system and become something that's processable by that community.
It's intelligible. It's something that can be understood in a way that you can't otherwise understand.
Right, but it's like what I learned from that story, at least what I've been ruminating on for the past several Christmases, is that like the way, or what I learned from that story, what I'm supposed to act out based on hearing that story, is that I need to step down from the things that are important to me and be part of somebody else's life. Manifest love and compassion and generosity and personness and Christ-likeness to them in their language, in their value system. It's like it's not just a matter of like becoming a different type of matter. It's like entering into something that's foreign to you.
Yeah, well, and which is, I think, itself one of the beauties of language and words, even sort of more specifically. Like there's this opportunity to take something that somebody doesn't know at all, they've never experienced, and you can actually give them a taste of that experience just by communicating with them, right? Like, oh, you've never been to Everest. Well, this is what it's like. Suddenly there's something so beautiful, I think, about the communicative power of, storytelling and the way that words form that. It's an art form that I find honestly endlessly beautiful. I really do. And in its own way, I mean, you're talking about the incarnation, but one of the interesting points that Scripture makes is that the Word became flesh. That's this act of incarnation, and the spoken act of God, or the spoken expression of God, sort of took this bodily form. And I've always thought it was interesting how the Holy Spirit is often referred to as breath, and so there's this image, probably heretical, that I have in my head.
That's okay. I see where you're going.
But where, like, this God is speaking, and the force of the words is the Spirit, but the actual words themselves is the Son, and yet they're expressions of the Father. Anyway, there's something really cool.
It's the definition of them, right? It's like building borders, or like it's like words are literally spirit. They are wind. They are breath that's been shaped, and that's been constricted into something more specific.
And yet they have a tremendous amount of flexibility and versatility, but not an infinite amount of flexibility and versatility, in the sense that a word can only mean so many things, right? And yet it means many things. And anyway, it's beautiful, and I think that there's something truly great about that. But.
So sorry to sidetrack that so much. You were
not at all.
Originally, I was talking to you. You were trying to answer the question of like what are these two principles you see for
right. So I'll trace my way back there. So we're here talking about the importance. I was saying how words matter because people matter, and language is this beautiful expression of kind of one-to-one opportunity to share of yourself through this medium. And unfortunately, that medium is deficient. Words are not sufficient to do the thing we're asking them to do. Right. So because I use the wrong word, or I use the wrong tone, the medium can produce any number of flaws, right? In my intent or what have you, right? Which is why discipline is so important, and learning how to do that well, how to carefully curate the words that you choose, the order you choose to use them in, your intent, even possible misinterpretations or counter arguments that somebody might have based on something you said or didn't say, like. All of that nuance of conversational skill and so on is something that's present in the form of something like an essay, where you learn how to structure an idea. You exclude a large number of ideas. It's a very, very limited thing you're doing, but you're focusing on the best or most persuasive bits of a point you're trying to raise. And as you learn, or practice, I should say, even more than learn, because I think most people know how to do this to a degree on their own anyway. But as you train that kind of muscle in your mind, you can become better at sort of tracing a thought, tracing an idea, spelling out an argument, and so on. And those aren't, when I'm saying argument too, I mean it in a really like simple kind of benign way. I don't mean like feuding and conflict and fighting. I just mean like, here's a point, counterpoint, argument. That's all. Yeah. So it's really innocuous in the way that I'm using it. But just so this point about being able to kind of critically think, logically trace an idea, to challenge something, to follow it through. That skill that you highlighted, that you said that I have, is something I've really learned from essay writing. I actually, in a conversation like I just did, I think I modeled it, where I actually worked in reverse of the tangents back to the original thought, more or less. So what I actually have in my mind, and maybe this is a quirk to me, but it's almost like a line that's running across, and then when it deviates, I have a little flag post in my brain that keeps a track of that. And I guess that's such
a useful skill. Like I noticed the difference between like a good public speaker and a bad public speaker is just like whether or not they're able to find their way back. And like watching some people do that, it's like, whoa, that's amazing. And it's amazing how much better I'm able to follow and remember what the lecture is about. And like, I've really like, even hear you model and break it down was really good. And also, I mean, you suggested me to read that book, How to Read a Book.
Oh, did you?
Incredible. I mean, that
it breaks
was
your
the
brain
biggest
a little
insight.
bit.
That really, it was just like, oh yeah, this is how I need to interact with books. This is how I interact with life.
Yes.
Right.
Well, so really that text. So How to Read a Book. I forget the actual authors because I've loaned my copy out so many times I don't even know who has it right now. But it was a game changer for me. And really all that was is a tome from two very accomplished professors who basically took their crash course in like logic and just condensed that into a text, right? It's basically just Logic 101. I had never been exposed to actual logic as a subject before, right? It's always implicit in the education system. So kind of goes back to that point I was making about, it's sometimes better to split up these subjects and see them as different things so that you can understand them better. But so all that to say, critical thinking is really important. And I think we've just modeled how useful it can be in a potentially deep and diverging conversation if you can't track it, right? But then the other bit's charitability. Like if you can dissect an idea as much as you want, right? But if you can't empathize with the holder of that idea, right? I think that they're like that sucks, man. Like I've been at the receiving end of someone who doesn't want to listen charitably, right? So they like one of the better bits of wisdom I picked up somewhere from somebody famous is that we judge ourselves by our intentions, right? But other people by their actions, right? So we very rarely will extend.
I don't think even think we bother to figure out what people's actions are. I think we judge them based on their affiliations or their labels.
And that may be true these days, but notwithstanding, if somebody cuts you off in the road, right, you're gonna be mad at them for having done the thing.
Exactly.
But if you cut somebody off, you don't feel necessarily bad about it. You might, but like, oh no, I really needed to get this exit. Anyway, notwithstanding, the point there is that we have, I think, often a double standard for what we hold ourselves to versus what we hold other people to. Right. And if you're not conscientious of that, like things like your own bias, right? Well, so not to get into the specific issue, but perhaps a good example of this it's a very contentious issue, but an example of where I had to suspend my own bias and be charitable to a different argument actually was around the issue of abortion. So big political subject, or can be. And, loosely put, one camp believes that you're, destroying human life, and another camp, they believe that's either an oversimplification or just not the case at all. Very competing ideas, arguably probably an irreconcilable difference, right? It's an issue of fundamental philosophical difference that affects that, right? And it occurred to me after reading a position that I don't want to belabor this too much, but essentially it was Pete Buttigieg, actually. I believe that's how you pronounce his name, so forgive me if that pronunciation is totally wrong. But the political gentleman from the South, the United States. I think he's from Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, mayor of Chicago or something to that effect. Anyway, currently Minister of Transportation, I think, in the Biden cabinet. Doesn't matter. I read a post that he had made, or it was a summary of a response that he gave at a presidential debate. Somebody tried to ask, what about late-term abortion? What about late-term abortion? And he tried to resist the question by saying, I feel like this is being asked just for soundbite issues. The anger or whatever it was persisted. And I'm summarizing here, but he effectively said that, if there's, late-term abortions are whatever number, maybe it's say it was 6,000. I don't think it was that high, but it was 6,000 in whatever year he cited, which represented less than like 0.2% of actual cases or something to that degree. And he pointed out that most of the people making that choice have probably painted the nursery, bought a crib, and they've been given some kind of terrible news where they had to make a decision, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's the health of the parent or whatever, right? Anyway, in the moment realizing this, I'm like, that response was filled with compassion for people in a situation that is, I think, objectively awful, right? If you're in that specific, so ignore all the other bits, but that one, which is such an extreme, I think, it's an extreme representation of these different camps, right? The man is showing compassion. And I stopped and realized that, wait, I agree with that, right? I don't think that it's the job of a government to impose a situation like their ethical standard on what ought to be a private medical decision as pertains to women's health. Now, I could separate that own statement I just made into all other kinds of nuances and boil it down for ages. But my point here is that I had to take my own very deeply felt religious views, and in this case, fairly conservative leaning as far as our political spectrum goes. I had to set those aside and suspend them to listen charitably to an opinion that I moments before would have considered reprehensible, right? And in that instance, I realized, wait a second, that gentleman just adequately expressed an idea that I agree with. Mm-hmm. That changes the way that I have to think about this other position I've taken. Right. And that begins the process then of critical thought, because now I've listened charitably and critically. I'm able to pair that back to this other thing that I hold. And suddenly I realize, okay, maybe this is an issue that matters a lot less than people make it out to be. Maybe we should focus on some other things that are affecting things in a much bigger way, right?
You were talking earlier about the idea that many disagreements are more a disagreement with maybe the mask or the title of the conversation or the title of the opinion more than the substance of the person's actual position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the key problem that I'm trying to figure out how to get better at solving. I think it's almost just a patience issue. Like most of the content, and because I'm used to having, there's so much content in my life, and content is such a big part of my life, being a 21st century person. Like I think about things in those terms, but it's just like the more content there is, the more I have to kind of distill it down to, okay, well, what am I actually going to spend my time watching? What gives me the most bang for my buck as far as, time invested versus like, probably versus dopamine rush.
Sure.
Right. And so most of the content, it's like I get used to kind of just taking in the junk food of the brain anyways. I get used to just like watching short videos, and like I realized maybe last year that I didn't want to watch movies, and I was like, why on earth?
Commitment.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I had gotten so sucked into this pattern of short form content and just being very, very judgmental of like, because again, when you have so much content, your mechanism for sorting it out has to become that much more judgmental, or else you're just going to get sucked into things arbitrarily. And they might be, there's so much garbage and so much noise, so much data you have access to that's totally useless. You have to become really good at sorting it out quickly and finding something that, that might interest you. Mm-hmm. And so investing time into a longer form piece of content became like, what if the movie sucks? I've just lost the potential to interact with 20 pieces of content where 15 of them could have been really, I could have at least really liked them. Maybe they wouldn't even have been useful to me, but I would have at least liked them. They would have hit that mental trigger that says, this is good. And it's like, how do you work on that? You just watch more. You have to just practice being patient, practice watching more crappy movies and being okay with it. Like try to find better movies. But like, okay, this is actually, I think maybe I've actually got back to that Bruxy Cavey nugget of wisdom. He was talking about exercise. I really didn't think I was ever going to get back here. I thought that this nugget was gone for good.
I had faith in you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having faith and grace. But he talked about how exercise is a pretty modern invention. Like people didn't use that's like a pretty recent word, exercise, because previously that's just existing. Yeah. Like just go out and live your life, and your body will be as strong as it needs to be to do the things that you're going to need to do physically because you're doing them. That's how you live your life. You're a farmer, you're a whatever, even if your life was working in any sort of other physical labor. It's just like almost all of our labor has migrated to sitting down, at least sitting down, maybe sitting down in front of a computer, maybe sitting down and talking to people, or maybe just standing at a cashier and talking to people. Like there's very, very little physical labor that's involved with most people's jobs in the West, in the developed world, right? And so we've had to figure out, that causes our bodies to degrade really quickly and to not be able to walk when we need to walk if we don't practice walking. We get like our cardiovascular health goes, we get winded standing up. Like that's no good. Obesity is an increasing. Like I don't know the statistics on it, but people who do, when I hear them talk about it, I'm confounded. It's insane how much of a problem. And it's just like, well, how do we deal with that? We had to figure out some ways of just deciding to be physical, and this is what he made the point that people started exercising. People started like taking time of their day, scheduling time to practice putting physical force on their body so that way their body could withstand it when they needed to do it, right? Yep. And then he compared that to praying or to meditating. Mm-hmm. He said like...
That's a good comparison.
And that's almost, maybe that's even exactly the comparison I was about to go with. It's just like meditation is almost indistinguishable from patience practice. It's just getting better at sitting down and being okay with things being a little bit slow to get to something a little bit more deep, a little bit more meaningful. Because there's so much bang you can get for your buck if you are really judgmental with content and just look for the best video all the time. But when you do that, you miss out. Usually our metrics for figuring out what the best thing is. It comes back to the food thing. It's like it's the same there's ways of hacking those systems where, like, previously in other points in time, something being really sweet would have been a good indicator that there was a lot of what I needed in it. And that's not really the case at this point. That's not a reliable faculty for interacting with food anymore, right? And when it comes to content, it's like there's hyper palatable content. There's lots of great porn out there.
Okay. Not where I thought you were heading. But do carry on, I suppose.
There's lots of really, really funny, quippy, offensive comedies that are really, ideologically cancerous.
Sure.
There's a ton of content that abuses our faculties for finding something that would be valuable to us. Right? We have these things built into our brains that like would tell us that would be worth investing in, worth investing time in. And those have been totally hacked. So we have to kind of push back and say, I'm going to exercise being patient with an idea, exercise being patient with interacting with somebody, exercise having a long form conversation rather than just having short content, 30-second, like memes.
Well, and one of the beautiful things about that, if one can take the time, right, exercise the patience to learn how to really to do something like what we're doing, where you just sit and have a longer chat about nothing in particular, and yet the beautiful thing that happens is you begin to notice themes, and that's one of the bits that I love. So it's interesting that you're likening this to movies versus sort of consuming things on social media. It's an apt, I think, analogy for really just the deficiencies that I see in our ability to appreciate story, right? So a lot of what I think about and talk about actually comes back to this kind of central idea. It's perhaps one of the nuggets of my my own psyche, maybe, whatever, but that a lot of other things are built on. But it's just the importance of narrative, the importance of storytelling, right? Identity formation. We don't often associate that with storytelling, but that is. Your identity is just the sum of the stories you tell about yourself.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're a better storyteller, you might be actually just a better person.
Oh, that's not what I mean to say. But,
but you might be able to, like, that's the resource you need in order to learn how to become a more actualized person, a fuller person.
I suppose it's more about awareness in that regard. If you are aware of the stories that you tell about yourself, if you know those threads, it's easier to orient what your identity even is and perhaps make adjustments should there be a need for that. But what I mean to say is well, I don't want to be uncharitable to Americans. The one of the big hallmarks of Canadian identity, I believe, is feeling arbitrarily superior to the United States for no reason whatsoever, right? Like, it doesn't matter how good we actually are as long as we're better than them, right? Like that's the attitude,
yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's a hallmark of any, maybe there's even potentially a healthy level of that. You want to at least identify more with your group than somebody else's group because you need to care more about your group because they're your problems.
Right.
But
I mean, well, I suppose, but let's say Canadian identity. So if we're talking about Canadian identity, what does it mean to be Canadian? That's a very odd question, perhaps, because the simple, I think, answer is, you have a passport that belongs to this governing body that exists in this border, right? So by fluke of circumstance, you are Canadian. There you go, right? But I think that question can go deeper, and I think it should go deeper. And so dismissing the easy answer, you begin to realize that it's actually questions about, well, what is this land and what makes up this land and who are the people that are in this land and what are the families associated with those people and what are the ideas associated with those families, and the matrix begins to expand pretty large, I would say. So you're suddenly capturing a very wide net of people from a very vast geographic area, but that nonetheless have some common thread of a story that unites them, right? Whether that's the story of Confederation and how the different provinces came to be, or whether that's these myths about Canadian politeness, right? Or whatever thread you sort of isolate as being the main variable there. The point is you're sharing a story of a kind, right? And I think it goes to show the power of story and shaping ideas. Depending on the story you tell about your nation, your family, yourself, you change your own sense of self-perception. You change how other people perceive you, right? So increasingly, I think that our stories are isolated and individualized, right? So the story that I tell about myself is going to be maybe even more particular than my family or town or a country, right? And that has all kinds of interesting changes, but challenges and opportunities that come with it. Like it's interesting, for example, that I could be part of an online community in Reddit that shares a similar idea or passion or interest or something, and there's a layer of identity formation that can happen there, depending. Well, I'm part of what's the thing that just happened in the news? The Wall Street Bets kind of became world famous overnight, right? Well, suddenly this subgroup of urchins, right, self-professed tards or whatever it is that they say in this subreddit have become world famous because of a thing that they've done. That's a story that they're telling themselves now, right? And if they take hold of that story, now there's a community or that's formed, or a greater sense of community that's formed. So, all that to say, I think it's interesting that, if we're content appreciation or whatever is being reduced to snippets, I think that there's an inability or if not inability, a lack of awareness of the kinds of stories we're telling ourselves, right? The stories we're being exposed to and how we compare ourselves to those heroes or to those villains, and our appreciation for following the thread of a character and so on. Like that's all missing, right? One of the only places you get that these days, actually, I would say, is in film, which is sometimes unfortunate because the better stories don't always make for the best-selling films, right?
But it's the same. Like, I mean, the How to Read a Book, that like you said, it's a game changer. Everyone should go read it. But
I agreed. It's so good. It's dry too. Oh my goodness, is it dry?
It really makes you like. It's like, okay, do you think this is enough of a problem to have to work on it? Because it's going to be work to get through that book. But it's such a useful skill because it's like one thing that I guess see. This maybe makes me a little bit optimism, even despite the really negative things I see about our content environment these days, is that I found a YouTube channel that I really liked, and it was pretty short form content, and it was well produced, and it was exciting, and it was funny. They're called Wisecrack.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you've heard of that channel. It was a great channel.
Actually, I've heard of it, but I haven't engaged it.
I like subscribed to that channel and watched like almost every video since like 2 years ago, and it was like it just caught me. It was well marketed and it worked, but what the content of it was like I didn't even know why I was watching their videos. It was just like I guess it was funny at first. They had these really funny takes, just like summarizing the themes of movies and making fun of them from an alien's perspective.
That's great.
Earthling cinema. That was a great. It was a great series. It was so funny, but it's like subliminally they got me really, really interested in starting to actually pay attention to. Oh yeah, what is this movie about? Like you kind of you can get into the just flow of just like, especially if you watch a lot of movies, it's just like it's just kind of going through you, and you're not really thinking about what it's about or what's in there or what would be useful even to take home from it. It's just like it's a passive interaction. But like when I started to realize how these interesting ideas they were pulling out of movies, I was like, wait, that's in there? That's like, you can do that with a movie? It challenged me to start unpacking movies and just literature in general. And it started to be like, whoa, there's so much more that's happening whenever you're engaging with something like this, especially something that's well done. Like listening to a good essay, or listening to a good sermon, listening to a good speech, or reading a good book, watching a good movie. It's like what makes it good is that you could actually spend some time on it, and your experience with it would get richer and richer the more time you spent with it.
Well, I'm a firm believer that a good spoilers, right? Everyone talks about spoilers and no, don't spoil this, don't spoil that, right?
It's like,
but
a good book
I genuinely
can't be spoiled.
believe. Well, that's what I mean. I would say the mark of a good story is you can know the ending and still enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
Right? And that I think is, again, it's an art form that's not as featured prominently perhaps as it maybe would merit being featured in our society. But I mean, I say all of this, and of course, I've done very little myself to actually adjust any of these, these things. Like I'm painfully aware of some of these inadequacies in my own life. Like, so my biggest literary inspiration is Tolkien, which is super normie and like totally like.
But it's for good reason, because he's so freaking good.
Well, but I don't know that a lot of people understand why he's good.
Right.
And that's the piece. Like, there's so many like Tolkien knockoffs, like Game of Thrones is just textbook Tolkien knockoff. I don't care who whatever. It's just taking the fanciful world or kind of world that he made and repackaging it, which is fine. Like I'm not opposed to it, but like there's something about the genius of Tolkien that really is timeless, and it's actually beautiful. I didn't mean to get here, but seeing as we've naturally kind of arrived there, the moment that changed it for me was in my final class at school. There was an assignment or a course that the specific course was designed to try and pull together all the different threads of everything you'd learned, sort of, but between different disciplines. So it was like most of the majors all were in the same class, where normally that wouldn't be the case. So you got to have sort of this interdisciplinary focus in the class. Really cool capstone to a great program. And one of the things that I came across in that program was this little leaflet that Tolkien authored called Tree and Leaf. If you haven't read it, absolutely read it. It will blow your mind. But Tolkien was a devout Catholic, right? And I mean devout. It was one of the bigger feuds between him and C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is often championed as being this great, Christian thinker from sort of the 20th century, probably the greatest Christian thinker in the 20th century. Anyway, really great guy. Chronicles of Narnia, cool. They were close friends. He was an atheist who became
equal and child, right?
Yeah, but so he became a member of the Church of England, which Tolkien never forgave him for, which is hilarious. So he was so mad he didn't become a Catholic. That's how kind of staunchly Catholic Tolkien was, and I love it. And there's beautiful bits of just sort of faith that actually trickle into the story that you might not pick up on if you weren't aware of that. My favorite example is lembas bread is actually modeled after communion, this bread that sustains beyond what normal bread could.
Interesting.
That's actually it's not an allegory, so he's not trying to make it a one-to-one sort of symbolic equivalence, but it was inspired by, and I think that's beautiful. But here's the point: in this leaflet, Tolkien wrote an essay. It's called On Fairy Stories, right? That was the shorthand back then for what we now call fantasy, which is a glorified term for what in his day
fairy stories.
No, they were great. It was a derogatory term,
yeah,
right? So he actually was writing this as the term would be an apology, as a defense of the genre of fantasy, because it was being looked down upon in his day, right? And I think that's fascinating. And the lectures, what he gave at Oxford, it's a codified version of that lecture. It blows your mind. Not only is it great, he talks about the rules of fantasy and how it all operates, right? Which is, cool in its own right to hear this masterclass talk about the principles that governed his own world building. Yeah. That's great, right? But he actually concludes that essay with a little statement talking about how the gospel found in the Bible is the greatest fairy story because it's the only fairy story that came true, right? Which is just what a thought. Right? Like here you have the epitome of the happy ending, right? Eternal life and goodness and all of the things that we look to in the hope of the good news of Christ. It's a fantasy. It's a fairy story. It's something too good to be true, and yet is. And I love that.
Yeah.
Now, the other half of this leaflet is it's called Leaf by Niggle. Now, just hear me, niggle. And a niggle in British culture was somebody who was they would procrastinate. They wouldn't get things done. Right, they would just sit and so on. So hear that distinction; it's an important one. So the story of this essay is that Tolkien was asked by a magazine to write an autobiography, and instead he submitted this piece of fiction. Okay? but here that is beautiful, okay? Because what the story tells is this painter who has this vision in his mind for a tree. And he keeps adding panel after panel after panel to this masterwork that he's painting, right? And there's this really annoying neighbor that he's got right next door who's a gardener, constantly plugging away at the plants and so on in the soil. And eventually they have to go on this great journey where they have to get on the train and go, and they find this meadow together, right? And in the meadow, they actually discover the tree that Niggle had been painting, but it was real this time. But it still wasn't quite finished. And he had to learn from his annoying gardener neighbor how to finish tending this tree that he had worked so hard to paint and bring into being, right? Before they move off over onto the mountains. It's an allegory for his relationship with C.S. Lewis and how he came about making the Lord of the Rings in the first place. It was an idea that continued to grow and build and build. And if it hadn't been for this
that is so beautiful.
Well, it is, but here you have paired together the rules that he sets out for how to write fantasy, how to write a fairy story. And then in the other, you have an example of how he does it, right? Yeah. So you've got this autobiographical work that is a beautiful piece of fiction. It has its own magical rules built into the world, but he doesn't stretch beyond them. He doesn't try to explain them. It's just, they have to go on a magical journey and they end up in a meadow with a magic tree or whatever, right? But it's beautiful and it's enchanted and you buy it. You agree. Like you get into, okay, this is what Niggle is and I forget Gardner's name. Yeah. Anyway, masterclass of storytelling. And again, I mean, I could rant about how beautiful.
That's the masterclass in life living, though it ends up being, because we talked about telling the story about the world to yourself and about yourself to the world and about other people to yourself and then to the world again. These are the ways that we interface with reality. That's what life is, from many angles, anyways. It's one of the most fundamental things about life is properly seeing and properly understanding, properly telling a story about life. And he wasn't able to do it until he went to his neighbor.
Right, but I mean, I think that premise that you've touched on there, it's so fundamental to everything we're talking about, right? It's this. I think the capacity or the beauty of people who can learn how to hear one another's stories such that they actually listen, right? Yeah. And who can share their own story in a way that's true to what they have understood and experienced, right? One other thing though that I do think merits mention, not to transition too aggressively out of that and talk about Tolkien, but again, I friggin' love that guy, what a genius. But we should also talk a little bit probably about Dissent and how important that actually can be. And what I mean is, here we're talking about these beautiful, fanciful, almost hippie kind of ideas of loving people and hearing about what they have to say and sharing. And I think all of that's lovely and should be done. At the same time, not all ideas are created equal. And there are certain ideas that don't deserve the same level of scrutiny or charitability. It's not to say that you still shouldn't hear those ideas out, but there are certain concepts, ideas, practices, and so on that are simply false or proven wrong or proven to be deficient. And we don't have to pretend that those same ideas and concepts are on the same level as everything else, right? I don't necessarily care to jump into another hot button issue or whatever, but flat Earth would be a simple example of this, where there's a point that's not for dispute. It's not a matter of opinion. It's factually incorrect, right? That doesn't need the same platform as an idea about something like maybe climate change or, I don't know, just poverty in general, whatever your issue happens to be. There can be contentious issues that are contentious for no reason, and they don't necessarily need to be, I'm not saying they don't need to be listened to, because you still need to hear out that individual, right? That person matters, and you need to care about that person. Yeah. But the idea that they are claiming to represent does not merit the same level of charitability. That's all I mean to say. So that distinction, I think, needs to be somewhere.
Yeah. So, well, because the only virtue is not just being patient and accepting all ideas and totally enveloping every person that you want to talk to or every idea that you're going to listen to into yourself. There's still an element of judgment that's important. It's just that
hence
right now,
critical thinking matters.
Looking at our current moment, anyways, what we're struggling with, anyways, is to engage more deeply and to be more accepting of ideas and of people. And specifically people are probably a good place to start, because the ideas, the systems that are in place for organizing ideas and building a worldview there are more intelligent and more deeply meaningful than the organization of information that the internet is using to create and distribute content.
Yeah, I mean, there's a person behind every username usually, which is something we have to pay attention to for sure.
Well, I think we figured it out.
Yeah, we solved it. Next issue. Okay, society is fixed. We got there.
Well, dude, let's actually. It might be fun to kind of dig into and unpack the whole Dissent thing another time. I literally wrote out a list of things I wanted to talk about with you, and we didn't talk about any of them. So maybe we should talk again sometime Anyways, but I'm getting to the point where probably my this is the critical moment where this is enough information to fit in my brain that I could process in a meaningful way. So we should probably end it here.
Oh no, I'd say wrapping here is just fine. I could. You're very easy to talk with. I could continue doing so for quite some time. So,
well, considering my current venture, that's a really, I appreciate that compliment. Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Any kind of engagement really helps out with algorithm stuff as far as I'm aware. Another thing I'd love if you would do would be to share this video with someone who you think might find it interesting or specifically might disagree with it about something or disagree with you about something, and use it as a launch pad to have an interesting conversation, have an interesting disagreement maybe, because that's really what this whole thing is about for me. I think that having, honest disagreements is a really useful and meaningful thing to do. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.